There are two hobbies that have consumed an inordinately large fraction of my life: fighting games and tabletop role-playing games. And for the longest time, I've struggled to bridge the gap between these two hobbies in a game that makes the most of their strengths. That is, until I discovered Panic at the Dojo. While this is technically not a new game, it is a relatively unknown game, and I'd like to give it a spotlight today. Panic at the Dojo, by Liberi Gothica Games, describes itself as a game of martial arts whimsy, a game that attempts to capture the feel of an action movie universe where every conflict is resolved through over-the-top martial arts fights. Panic is not strictly tied to a specific setting. You can use it to run a modern-day brawler, a fantasy epic, or even giant robots, as long as combat is at the front and center. There have certainly been martial arts-themed tabletop RPGs out there for a while now. Feng Shui, Tenra Bansho Zero, Anima Prime, Legends of the Wu Lin, and even a few RPGs specifically designed with fighting games in mind. I actually helped advise for this one here. But where I feel most of these games succeed in capturing the flavor of fighting games and martial arts, Panic does so through its system design and game flow. You might think that tabletop RPGs and fighting games are conceptually incompatible. Tabletop RPGs are cooperative storytelling games with PvE gameplay focused on guiding players through an interactive fiction, whereas fighting games are focused on PvP gameplay as a contest of skill between two players. Panic at the Dojo neatly bridges those two impossible gaps through its design and its philosophy. After all, the Game Master is a player too, and they are encouraged to fight for the win. So, what is Panic at the Dojo? For the uninitiated, Panic at the Dojo is a tabletop RPG, a game that is traditionally played with paper, dice, and sometimes a battle map and miniatures. You might recognize that it plays a little similar to a modern strategy RPG, or for the more recently initiated, it plays a lot like Baldur's Gate 3, as its gameplay is quite literally adapted from the rule set of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. While it's easy to imagine translating a turn-based RPG into a tabletop game, translating the real-time dynamics of a fighting game is a little different. But that's where Panic at the Dojo comes in. First, there's character creation. To make a character in Panic, you start by choosing an archetype, which determines your playstyle, sort of like Rushdown, Zoner, or Grappler. There are 13 archetypes that cover everything from traditional tanks who control aggro, gun-wielding zoners, or bruisers with comeback rage mechanics. For instance, if I wanted to make Ryu from Street Fighter, I would choose an archetype that allows me to be flexible and adaptable to any situation, which is why I have made him into a cyborg. Archetypes do not have to be literal. You can reflavor them into whatever you want. It's also possible to have more than one archetype. A fusion character picks 2 archetypes and gets the best of both worlds, and a frantic character picks 3 archetypes for an ever-changing myriad of techniques. Once you pick an archetype, you need to create 3 stances, which are 3 movesets that you can swap between. You create a stance by combining a style from your archetype with a form. Think of styles and forms as 2 halves of a moveset that you can mix and match. Once you have your 3 stances, you have everything you need to fight. Combat is where things get really interesting. In a typical tabletop RPG, any action you take that has a chance of failure is resolved by rolling a dice and getting either above or underneath a target number, depending on the system. Attacking someone with your longsword? Roll d20 versus armor class. Unlocking a door? Roll d20 versus difficulty class. Resisting a spell? Roll d20 versus spell save DC. This is a simple way of adding some risk and unpredictability to actions, but it's also kind of binary in execution. You throw the dice and your success or failure is determined purely by chance. That's not the case in Panic at the Dojo. To make any action, you need one of 2 resources: action dice or tokens. Action dice, which are granted by your stance, are rolled at the beginning of your turn and are spent to perform actions. Every action has a cost, and you can perform that action by spending a dice that matches or beats that cost. Some actions gain additional effects if you spend bigger dice on them, like the Shockwave action that deals 1 damage to every enemy within range, but deals an additional 2 damage to one enemy if you spent a 6 or better on it. You can take as many actions in a turn as you have action dice, so stances or abilities that grant more dice can be really advantageous. Tokens are generated by actions and come in different types. The basic tokens are speed, power, and iron. Speed tokens are spent as your primary form of movement. Power tokens can be spent to increase the damage of your attacks. And iron tokens can be spent to block incoming damage and are often your primary form of defense. There are other tokens that can affect the battle in various ways. Any action that can manipulate tokens can potentially manipulate any token, creating for the potential for really inventive strategies. Certain actions can cost tokens instead of action dice, in which case they can be used as many times as you have tokens to spend. Panic at the Dojo also handles initiative in a really unique way. As tabletop RPGs are often played in groups, the most common form of combat you'll find is group combat between a party of players and a group of enemies. Naturally, the larger group can take more turns and thus dish out more attacks than the smaller party. This is called turn advantage, and it is the bane of any game master who wants to run a dangerous encounter against a single boss. And if the players ever get turn advantage over a boss, your boss encounter will quickly turn into this. Panic at the Dojo is designed to handle combat of any scale, a dramatic one-on-one, a mob fight against a horde of goons, or even a team of heroes against one super boss. If any one side has less fighters, they will get extra turns and extra health, sort of like the ratio system from Capcom vs SNK 2. If any combatant gets knocked out, they will remain on the initiative and lend their action dice to their allies. So if the party is down to their last man, they get to make a heroic last stand. And if the enemy is down to their last man, they won't go down without a fight. Let's look at a short gameplay demo. Our heroes, Shoji and Rika, must stop the villain, the nefarious Mephisto, from completing his ritual and absorbing the power of the dormant god Razul. This is a heavyweight battle, and all fighters have 16 HP. Mephisto, the boss, has 2 health bars and 2 turns. Shoji drops into his Wild Inferno stance. Rika takes up her Jumping 1-2 stance. Mephisto assumes the Taunting Control stance. Shoji takes the first turn. He rolls his action dice and gets an 8, a 6, and a 5. He spends his 5 to gain 5 speed tokens, using 2 of them to move next to Mephisto. He then uses Ignition to apply a burning token to Mephisto at the cost of giving one to himself. He then spends his 6 to attack Mephisto for 3 damage, pushing him back 1 square. However, because of Mephisto's Taunting Control stance, Mephisto receives 1 iron token from taking damage. Shoji spends 1 more speed token to close the distance, then spends his last 2 speed tokens to activate Fury and deal an additional 1 damage to Mephisto, triggering Mephisto's ability once again to grant him 1 more iron token. Finally, Shoji spends his 8 to attack Mephisto 1 last time for 4 damage and push him back 2 spaces. In response, Mephisto uses 2 iron tokens to reduce the incoming damage by 2 and prevent the pushback, taking a total of 2 damage and gaining 1 more iron token from his passive. At the end of his turn, Shoji takes 1 damage from his burning token, and Mephisto is pushed back 1 more square from the effect of Fury. However, because of Shoji's Wild Inferno stance, he takes an additional 3 burning tokens after taking burn damage. Mephisto takes the next turn. He rolls his action dice and gets an 8, a 5, a 3, and a 2. Mephisto's Taunting Control stance lets him add a number to his action pool equal to twice the damage he's sustained. Since Shoji dealt him 6 damage, he adds a massive 12 to his action pool. First, Mephisto spends his 3 to use Suppression, granting him a control token and moving 1 space towards Shoji. He uses his 2 to use Is That All You've Got, issuing a challenge token to Rika and gaining 1 iron token. With a challenge token, Rika must use her turn to attack Mephisto, which is fine because there's no other enemies anyway. Mephisto then uses his 8 to use Not Good Enough, inflicting 6 weakness tokens to Rika and removing the challenge token. He turns his attention to Shoji and uses his 5 to attack him for 3 damage and push him back 1 space. Unknowingly, he springs Shoji's trap. With his wild Inferno stance, Shoji responds to Mephisto's attack by taking his 4 burning tokens and transferring them to Mephisto instead. Enraged, Mephisto spends his 12 to deal a massive 5 damage to Shoji and push him back 3 squares. At the end of his turn, Mephisto takes 5 damage from burning tokens, which triggers his passive ability and grants him 1 more iron token. Rika takes the next turn. She rolls her action dice and gets a 6, a 4, a 3, and a 2. At the start of her turn, she grants a 2-point shield to herself and Shoji. Her jumping 1-2 stance allows her to teleport 3 spaces towards Mephisto. She spends her 4 to use Leap In, teleporting 1 more space towards Mephisto and dealing 2 damage. However, because of her weakness tokens, she reduces the outgoing damage by 2 and removes 1 token. Rika's jumping 1-2 stance also lets her take bonus attacks each time she deals damage, so her extra attack would have dealt 1, but is also buffered by weakness tokens, removing a 2nd token in the process. She uses her 3 and her 2 to launch 2 more attacks against Mephisto, each with their own bonus attacks, resulting in a flurry of 4 strikes, dealing 0 damage but removing 4 weakness tokens. Finally, with her last action dice, she uses her 6 to attack Mephisto for 3 damage. Anticipating this, Mephisto uses his control token to negate her attack entirely. At the end of her turn, Rika teleports 3 spaces away. On Mephisto's next turn, he takes up his reversal ogre stance, anticipating the hero's next assault. Will Shoji and Rika be able to stop Mephisto in time before his ritual ascends him to godhood? In all aspects, it may sound like I've been describing a role-playing game just like most others, but I think what makes Panic at the Dojo feel like a fighting game is how it puts less emphasis on chance and more emphasis on strategic decision-making. In Dungeons & Dragons, your ability to succeed at anything will always boil down to a roll of the d20, and while you can skew the odds in your favor with abilities, traits, or even favorable circumstances, it's exceedingly rare that you will ever skew those odds into 100%. Which means it is entirely possible to line up every possible advantage you have and create the most optimal opportunity to succeed, only to fail anyway due to the whims of the dice. I know that's just the nature of RNG, but man, it just feels bad sometimes. But in Panic at the Dojo, every outcome is a result of strategic decisions made by both combatants. If you manage to land a blow, it's because you successfully maneuvered into a position that allowed it, and if you manage to defend against an attack, it's because you made the decision to anticipate it. And while fighting games involve making a myriad of micro-decisions in mere split seconds, Panic does a good job of getting a player to think more about their circumstances than simply entrusting everything to a d20. There are so many possible ways to build characters in Panic that it's unlikely there's ever going to be a singular dominant strategy. There are ways to bypass pure defense builds, there are ways to deny pure damage builds, there are ways to chase down zoning builds, and if damage simply isn't doing the trick, you can always hurl an enemy off the stage and win through ring out. The options are so open-ended that it's easy to imagine how to expand on this game with additional archetypes, styles, and forms to allow even more character builds. If I wanted to, I could do entire roster builds for Street Fighter, Tekken, Guilty Gear, pretty much anything. One area that I've overlooked when comparing the difference between fighting games and tabletop games is perhaps the most obvious. The focus of fighting games is on PvP interaction, getting into mind games and trying to outmaneuver an opponent on an equal playing field. More traditional tabletop games, by contrast, can be called PvE games, where the environment in this case is the game master who presents obstacles to oppose the players with. And while it is a game master's job to challenge the players, it is ultimately within the game master's interests for the players to succeed. And so a game master's portfolio of obstacles often includes smaller, more menial challenges that empower a player through their simplicity, or overtly overwhelming challenges that push players to struggle and overcome. But what I really think gives Panic a distinctly fighting game feel is how much the game seems to focus on the concept of equalizing combat. Not only is the initiative designed in such a way that neither GM nor player ever gets to overwhelm the other with turn advantage, but enemies and NPCs in Panic are built from the same toolbox that players use, following the exact same rules and mechanics. When I playtested this game with my friends, we played a two-phase battle. One phase against a band of mooks, and a second phase against a single powerful boss with 3 stances of his own. It wasn't long before I stopped playing as a boss character and started playing as a player, carefully considering what the player's abilities were and how to counter and outmaneuver them. And as soon as my players figured out what I was doing, they also bucked up and tried some weird stuff to throw me off and counteract my build. After a while, it became a true PvP, and I actually won in the end. I know it's typical GM courtesy to let the players win. It's generally in the group's best interest to let the players win, because if they don't, then the game's over. I haven't really talked that much about Panic's narrative systems because, to be honest, there's not a lot. But one of them that I think is important is that before you start any battle, you need to establish the stakes. You need to make it clear what the players or the enemies would lose or gain from the outcome of a fight. And assuming your players didn't wager their own lives on the stakes, that means the game isn't necessarily over if they lose the battle, which means it's okay for the GM to win. I've learned a lot about game design over the years of playing tabletop RPGs and understanding them. There are a lot of elements about tabletop RPGs that are difficult to explain if you only look at things like mechanics or writing. And one of those is a nebulous concept called game feel. In tabletop RPGs, I think game feel comes down to what experience the game as a whole is emulating, both through narration and through mechanics. The dice and math of a tabletop RPG are an abstraction of what the experience is meant to feel like. Combatants in D&D aren't literally taking turns hitting each other, but it puts you in the mindset of making each turn the highlight of an epic high fantasy battle. In a single turn, you could hew into a mighty beast with your great axe, or blast a horde of goblins with a well-placed fireball. Likewise, the mechanics of a game like Call of Cthulhu are meant to put you in the mindset of a cosmic horror story. The revelation of horrifying ancient powers puts you in a mindset where instead of wanting to fight and conquer everything you see, you would rather much scramble to survive and clutch onto what sanity you have left. This is what I think makes Panic at the Dojo special, because the way you think about how you play puts you in the mindset of a fighting game. You start thinking about spacing and neutral. You start assessing what the enemy's game plan is and how to counteract it. You begin leveraging your resources and waiting for an opportunity to capitalize on a foe's opening to lay out a huge combo. And because the GM is actively fighting back against you, they are likely doing the same. I personally cannot wait to run a full game for my friends and see what kind of battles we throw together. Panic at the Dojo is available on drivethrurpg.com and from Liberi Gothica's own itch.io page. All you need to play is the PDF and either a virtual tabletop program or some paper, pencils, a set of gaming dice, and something to pass around as tokens. It's relatively cheap, so go ahead and pick it up, support the devs, find some friends, and get ready for the next battle. That's all for today's new challenger. This is a little different from normal, but I'm interested in branching out and seeing if anyone else might be interested in talking some tabletop gaming. Be sure to leave a like and a comment, and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content from Sugar Punch. We're still active on Patreon, so be sure to check it out and support the channel for early access to future videos. I'm ABI, and I'm excited to run this game for the first time with my friends. See you next time.